published by the FIU libraries, especially the Ayala collection of Latin American, Cuban and Latin American popular music that co-sponsors the event, as well as the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center. Always a pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Lilian Guerra, who is a professor of Cuban and Caribbean history at the University of Florida in Gainesville. She recently received the University of Florida's Research Foundation professorship and held a Waldo Baker term professorship. If we had the funds, we would name her something like permanent visiting scholar here at FIU, because we've invited her several times to talk about various topics. Jose Antonio Echevarria, Uber Matos, the social and political origins of the Cuban Revolution, the urban insurrection in the 1950s, the route of the Mariel Exodus, and most recently the historical links between Cuba and Puerto Rico. She earned her PhD and MA in Latin American history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her BA in history and Spanish at Dartmouth College, and is the author of 4 major academic books. The most recent one is titled Heroes, Martyrs, and Political Messiahs in Revolutionary Cuba, 1946 to 58, published last year, and we had the pleasure of presenting it at Books and Books. Prior to that, she published Visions of Power in Cuba, Revolution, Redemption, and Resistance, 1959 to 71, published in 2012. And this book earned a very prestigious Rice Wood Prize from the Latin American Studies Association, LASA. Prior to that, The Myth of Jose Marti, Conflicting Nationalism in Early 20th Century Cuba. And the 4th title, which was the first that she published, was called Popular Expression and National Identity in Puerto Rico, the Struggle for Self, Community, and Nation. I always like to point out that this is probably one of the few master's theses that has ever been published as a book. At least I know a couple of those cases. And it's really a terrific examination of primary sources about Puerto Rico in the early 20th century. Today's lecture forms part of the 5th book in progress, which I think is titled the same way. No?
Yes.
And let's see where my part.
Patriots.
Patriots and Traitors in Revolutionary Cuba, covering 1961 to 81, which should be forthcoming from Duke University Press. In addition to these books, she has published several articles in professional journals such as Hispanic American Historical Review, Cuban Studies, Social History, the Journal of Caribbean History, and close to my heart, the Revista de Ciencias Sociales, which I edited some time ago. Currently, she's also the book editor of the interdisciplinary academic journal Cuban Studies, which I think is still the major reference on this topic, and she is doing a marvelous work, including books published both in the U.S. and in Cuba. Moreover, she has published several literary publications, 3 poetry collections in Spanish, Cimarrona, published in 2013, Revelaciones Exóticas, 2004, Cuentos y Fragmentos de Aquí y de Allá, a book of poems in 2003, and has authored a book of short stories in Spanish titled Cartografía Corporal, which we also presented some time ago. Recently, she received fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and this year she received the also very prestigious, although more modest, award from the Ayala Library Travel Grants here at FIU. So in sum, I think Lilian Guerra is certainly one of the most accomplished, productive, and insightful scholars on the contemporary history of Cuba and the Caribbean. We're very happy to have her here. Please help me welcome her.
It's really nice to be here. I'm very grateful to have a microphone because it makes it a lot easier. This is an informal talk. Let me thank some people because, in fact, in the last 4 days, I feel that they've become family. I know they're very happy to get rid of me at this point because I've milked them dry. But the director of the Diaz Ayala collection, Veronica Gonzalez, and certainly Natalie, who painstakingly digitized in real time from LPs about 70 songs for me. And Jorge Duani, of course, for inviting me and all of them for providing this wonderful opportunity. So what I want to do is first warn you that about half of this talk, or more than half of it, which is about the Diaz Ayala materials, I just looked at them. So I concluded my research collection last night at 6 p.m. and effectively started this PowerPoint at 11 o'clock last night. However, the book is a book that I've been working on for several years, and with all books on revolutionary Cuba, the struggles to get materials about the revolution and to work in Cuba means that you do need to spend years on works like this. And so I want to start with some formal thoughts and then proceed into, I think, what will be both an entertaining and interesting contribution to your thoughts today about the work itself, about the music and the period of the 70s, which remains a really under-investigated blank spot in our understanding of Cuban history. Well, in 1961, I will argue that the Cuban Revolution entered a completely new era, and it did so because of two major events that consolidated local support and international legitimacy for both the Castro regime and for the victory of Cuba over its most immediate repressor for the previous 60 years, and that was the United States, at least with respect to its political sovereignty and to a certain degree its economic sovereignty. So those two events were the victory of Cuban forces over the CIA-backed invasion at the Bay of Pigs and the now legendary conclusion of the mass literacy campaign that mobilized hundreds of thousands of teenage volunteers to teach very basic reading skills to about 1 million people. These political triumphs, official triumphs, signaled a change and signaled this kind of, sort of a shift in terms of the radicalization of the state and the belief on the part of its leaders that effectively the people were 100% behind them. Now, the name of the book and the name of this, or the title of the book, comes from this particular poster precisely because it is from 1961. And it sets up what will be the paradigm in which young people are, and all Cubans, are expected to live effectively eternally to this day. You are either a patriot or a traitor. You are not allowed to be neutral. Fidel said there were no neutrals as early as 1960. No había neutrales. But this idea that you grew up in a context in which you were supposed to pick a side became all the more complicated after the defeat of the exile forces at the Bay of Pigs. And I would say increasingly so, because as the book argues, the young people of the time were expected to be not just united, and citizens were not expected to just be united behind the state. They were expected to be unanimously behind the state. Unanimidad was the goal and the means by which the revolution's advancement would be judged, as well as citizens' loyalty. So the performance of loyalty, I also argue, in this work and others, was actually more important than loyalty itself, showing that you believed, meaning that you attended rallies. These things were no longer spontaneous after 1960. Attendance at rallies became a measure of one's commitment, but it was also something orchestrated by the state, directly and openly. So through centers of work, through schools, through one's community block organizations, which are called Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, there was what I've called in a previous book the rallification of daily life and the construction of a grassroots dictatorship from below, in which complicity of the citizenry with what is a state that effectively grants the citizens only the right to be deputies of the state, doesn't really grant citizens the right to control the state or to determine policies. That is what we get after 1961. And over the next 2 decades, Cuba's youngest citizens would prime themselves for the opportunity to replicate the sacrifices of an anti-imperialist pantheon of historic martyrs that were effectively taught to them in all dimensions of their existence. And my concern in this book in particular is looking at the way in which in the 1970s the goal of education was no longer political education. Fidel had said in the 1960s, la educación política es educación. In the 1970s, as of 1973, it would no longer be educación política, it's educación comunista es educación. So the goal after 1972, in particular, when Cuba would become a permanent part of the Soviet Union and be integrated into the Soviet bloc, would shift into a direction of ideological conformity to an ideal of perfection. And this ideal of perfection would make what Fidel called Cuba into una aula gigantesca, right? One giant classroom, a gigantic classroom. But in addition to the notion that all people were supposed to learn to be good communists, they were also supposed to make the state part of themselves. In fact, the defeat of doubt is something that comes up in this image. You know? he asks, this is a quote from Fidel Castro's speech at the time of the visit of the Soviet premier, the only Soviet premier to visit Cuba before Gorbachev would do so in 1989. This idea, ¿quién duda que algún día? Nobody was supposed to doubt. And in fact, doubt was supposed to be the enemy of the triumph of the revolution. So if you had doubt inside, you were supposed to beat it out. And if you had doubt, you were also an enemy of others because you could demoralize others, since doubt was contagious. And so this idea became integral to classroom life, to work life, to everybody's life. And so this notion too was also that one had to become part of the collective from the moment of birth, is something also, I would say, somewhat new. It emerges not in the 60s, but in the 70s, when committees for the defense of the revolution, which existed on every block, would suddenly become, a membership in committees for the defense of the revolution would become mandatory. So that happened in 1968. But registration in the committees became mandatory in the 1970s for children as young as 1 day old. And so you were supposed to register as a member of the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, before the age of 3. And there were ceremonies around this, this kind of the creation of a baptism. And it was actually called a baptism. So in other respects, the círculos infantiles also get created in the 1970s, much more so on a massive scale. These are government-run daycare centers that were supposed to free mothers from the labors of raising children in the home, but importantly, they became in the 70s central places for the creation of what the Ministry of Education in 1973 would call the creation of a communist personality in every child. La creación de una personalidad comunista en cada niño. And that phrase, when I first read it, kind of blew me away. So a lot of this material, the research that I've done so far, has been about education, and particularly the kind of pressure that young people had to deal with, the pressure of needing to be perfect. So what you've been seeing here, or what you will be seeing in the next few minutes, are a series of posters that were distributed all over schools in the 1970s. And this poster in particular is part of a series where Fidel is quoted, and he is quoted as calling the youth to a maximum point of perfection. O sea, el perfeccionismo. That was the goal of the creation of a communist personality in every child. So implicit in this is the odd, I think, somewhat paradoxical argument that the state was somewhat already perfect. The state was comprised of communists. In 1975, with the new communist constitution, only other communists were endowed with the right to criticize any communist. So effectively, criticism is narrowed, and those who can participate officially in critiques of leaders must be the leaders themselves. So become perfect was part of your goal as a young person, so that you could one day be like those who had created the state and those who comprise the state. And effectively, that means that there is a ramping up of pressure on young people in this paradigm of patriots or traitors. Now, what I argue is that effectively, in the 1970s, Cuba was not really one large classroom. It was really much more of a vast reformatory, where the degree of surveillance was not just exercised by the state, but also by the individual. And the individual was called to create a kind of surveillance system in his own or her own consciousness. So the question is, did it work? And my answer is no. It did not work. In fact, part of the book ends in 1981, and a lot of my research already written has been about Mariel, because Mariel is effectively a moment in which you have a massive outpouring of dissent and opposition from effectively the new man, from young people who were raised and educated in the revolution, young people who didn't know anything besides the revolution. And we know this because 72% of the 125,000 Marielitos who came were male. We also know that about 30% of them were black. We also know that the average age was 25 years old. That's incredible. So this is absolutely the reverse of those who had come in the 1960s in terms of every one of those aspects of their character. In Cuba, the response of the state to what was this overt act of dissent was to organize meetings of repudiation across the country. And we don't recognize this today. A lot of us have forgotten about it, and there's a tremendous stigma attached to being a Marielito even to this moment, both because of what happened to them in Cuba, but also because of how they were received in Miami, for all the reasons that I just said. They were young, they were working class, they were male, they had a way of speaking and thinking and acting that was a product of the revolution, and yet they had opposed the revolution and had been extraordinarily courageous in doing so over the course of 5 months. So the biggest moment is April 19th to about the end of May. That's about 86,000 people left Cuba, but the entire process of the Mariel lasts until October 31st. So in that process, not only are those who leave traumatized by this massive outpouring of what you could think of as organized hate, and that odio was effectively one of the terms that was used openly to inculcate this in citizens, the idea that they were on the right if they remained, and they condemned those who left. But I would say not only are the victims traumatized, but those who participated in these events would also feel it for years, and so much so that they are very reluctant to talk about it, those who live on the island and those who live in Miami, those who participated in these meetings of repudiation. So with that, I kind of want to show you a few more images of precisely where we're going to go with the music. The notion that the state would stick to certain ideas, like Comandante en Jefe Ordene, from 1961 is important. There is coherence to the policies of the state with respect to surveillance of citizens' consciousness. However, the central question of this book, and one that I think can be uniquely answered through cultural history, is the following. What was it like to grow up in a world framed by patriots and traitors? What kind of consciousness did such constant, coherent focus on the development of political purity produce? Is it possible to crack open the many black boxes of personal experience that defined what it meant to live in revolutionary Cuba within or outside the all-or-nothing paradigm of patriots and traitors? More importantly, perhaps, how did Cuban leaders in the Communist Party go from teaching the work of the revolution, as Fidel had called it in 1961, to policies of outright repression, exclusion, and mandates of purity and perfection? So one of the burdens that Cubans faced is that they needed to live up to Fidel. Everyday heroes, the goal of perfection, and the pedagogy of love. These were the three central principles of the curriculum of the 1970s through the 1980s. The demand, or the burden placed on young people was particularly strong because they were told this, that the leaders had already been absolved. They were absolved by history. And so you now had to live up to something that you could never reproduce. You could never reproduce the events of the 1950s. You could never give your life in the fight against Batista, and yet the standard by which you should live is precisely that standard. So what I've found is in the curriculum in particular, Fidel is at the center of every book in the 70s. Books for an integrated education, like Con Fidel y Con la Historia, depict a protagonist who's a mini Fidel. He's like a little child Fidel. Of course, he has a beard. In this picture, we have a black little child whose beard is falling off, so we make sure that we know that there's only one Fidel. But this idea that you create and you identify with a mini Fidel, and that there is no chronology to these books that purport to teach the history of the revolution to children, matters. In fact, it matters because the method of teaching history was not to teach the events themselves, but to teach how you were to feel about these events, which side you were supposed to take. And emotions were the main vehicle for promoting a particular interpretation of the past. It was not the order of events that mattered, it was the feelings evoked by the knowledge of those events. And so this is as true of children's books and children's curriculum for 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds as it was true of college curriculum. in which you have the same approach. So instructional themes for a 2-week course unit for preschoolers, 2 to 4 in all the daycares, which numbered about 10,000 in the 1970s. Our friends, the gorillas, day 1. Day 2, animals who drink mother's milk when they are born. Day 3, mother hen and her chicks. Day 4, flowers for Camilo Cienfuegos. Other instructional themes and activities meant to form proper mental attitudes among 3 to 4-year-olds. Let's learn to cross the street. Who cures us when we're ill? How to remember our martyrs. Our favorite toys. Martí, friend of children, and our friend the milicia. So children were also in preschools to learn how to be good communists by taking part in manual labor. And so certain skills taught in preschools that were to provide direct experience included children pulling weeds in the yard of the círculo that should take place at least 3 times a week, and field trips to the campo where they could witness adults doing voluntary labor for the state. So a lot of my work is about the pedagogy of these times, but it's also about the role of the imperial witness. And that meaning that Americans who would go to Cuba and live there, potentially, would become voceros for the revolution's perspective and for the experience of children and young people in particular. And so you have a plethora of books that are written by Americans, for Americans, and for others that concern the experiences of children. Children become, and young people, but especially the younger you are, the more so, they become the revolutionaries. And the revolutionaries define what it means to be a revolutionary, not in terms of their present-day circumstances, but for in terms of their desire for those circumstances of the past that produced martyrs. So you get this bizarre scenario in which you are to live in the hopes of one day dying for the state, for the revolution. And the highest goal is to one day be a martyr for the state. And when you can't be a martyr, you are supposed to honor your martyrs. So when I stepped into the Diaz Ayala collection, I have as a method the belief that you do not create an argument and then find material for your argument. On the contrary, you have arguments in history because they are source-driven. You let the sources drive where you go. And what I found in particular upstairs was that I didn't have to work hard at all to find that in the music of the 1970s, and especially in La Nueva Trova, which is ballad singing, you have exactly the same principles that were reflected in the pedagogy, in the books, in the stories that effectively led me to look at pedagogy. So in the oral histories that I've done so far. Grupo de Experimentación Sonora, which is established in 1967, is established precisely out of 3 main singers, or from 3 main singers, 2 of whom had already been sanctioned by the state. So Pablo Milanés had spent about 2 years in UMAP camps, which are forced labor camps. About 30% of those sent there were people who were homosexual or accused of being homosexual, but 70% were people accused of what was called ideological diversionism, an official spectrum of political crimes. I've written a lot about that, so I won't go into great detail about it, but effectively it included the crime of being a pseudo-intellectual, overly pseudo-intellectual, sobre-intellectual, people who doubted, dudadores, right? I mean, it's incredible, right? Desmoralizadores, demoralizers. So he was there for one of those reasons or many. In addition, Silvio Rodriguez had been sanctioned not by being sent to the UMAP camps, but he had served in his Servicio Obligatorio Militar, which was after 1964, obligatory military service for all young men over the age of 14. And in that process had somehow been flagged. And his music of that time, prior to his rehabilitation, we can say, and the creation of this group, was music that reflected not just doubt, but ambiguity, ambivalence, and critique. And so this organization, El Grupo de Experimentación Sonora, was the craft of Aide Santa Maria, who is the head of the Casa de las Americas, and an effort to take these brilliant musicians and to give them a space and effectively to have them direct their energies to the revolution's goals and purposes. So Grupo de Experimentación Sonora was really an effort to rehabilitate and to reform these singers. Now, by the early 70s, La Nueva Trova was the state. It is what I found and what I shall argue. La Nueva Trova had become a movement, and it had become a movement that was institutionalized. So there was an Instituto de la Nueva Trova. So that means an agency of the state created for people who wanted to sing this kind of music and create this kind of music. So what kind of music was that? Well, certainly a lot of it was political music, and you just have to get a sampling of song titles from the Díaz Ayala collection to see what I mean. So, hay un almanaque lleno. Is everybody here speak Spanish? Hopefully. Okay, so, hay un almanaque lleno de 26 by Noel Nicola, who was also a member of a Grupo, the three leaders of that organization, the Grupo Experimentación Sonora. Girón Preludio by Sara González. Girón La Batalla by Sara González. Girón La Victoria by Sara González. Canción de los CDRs, I love this one, which is the song of the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution by Eduardo Ramos. La Masa by Silvio Rodríguez. Los Mártires de Granma by Silvio Rodríguez. Canción para Angela Davis by Pablo Milanés, president of the Communist Party of the United States, and had become a communist in 1967 after she had returned to the United States from Cuba. Visited Cuba 4 times, and I have I'm writing a new, where I've written an article that's coming out about her and about Black Panthers in Cuba. So stunned to find this wonderful song. Moncada by Pablo Milanés, Columna Juvenil de Centenario by Silvio Rodríguez, Canción a una microbrigadista by Silvio Rodríguez. These are the folks who volunteered to construct public housing. Elegía, a Lázaro Peña, founder, one of the 1930s veterans of the Communist Party, by Martín Rojas. Siempre es 26 by Martín Rojas. Por supuesto siendo bala by Belinda Romeo. And here, these two songs in particular serve as a bridge to what I think is a much more interesting set of music and relationships to the architecture of consciousness and the soul. In both Por Supuesto Siendo Bala and El Bala by Pablo Milanés, the protagonist is literally a bullet. And it is an ode to the bullet who kills, and the sacrifice of a bullet and what a bullet means. Now, transferred to the larger context of Latin American military dictatorships in the 1970s and the 80s, this music would be radically popular among opposition to those dictatorships. But sung and played in Cuba, it has a completely different function, and it has a completely different effect. So these kinds of album covers also reveal how, in fact, the fusion of music to weapons would effectively visually reflect the official position of the state, coming from a lecture, a speech given by Fidel, in which he said que el arte como la música son armas de la revolución. So music, like art, was a weapon of the revolution, and here we have an album, La Canción, un arma de revolución. I mean, like yesterday, you have no idea how, or 3 days ago when I started this research, I almost fell over. It was so extraordinary to find one after another of these kinds of works, and to see them create an argument on their own. So, Los Trovadores also became publicity agents, apologists, and promoters of particular understandings of what directed culture meant. And so cultura dirigida was sort of a euphemistic way by which outsiders to Cuba, who were nonetheless supporters of the revolution, talked about and framed censorship, effectively the creation of a situation in which you were free to agree, and you were free to agree and express your agreement through La Nueva Trova in particular. So some of the wonderful statements that really encompass this come from Pablo Milanés, who was interviewed here in Puerto Rico in 1982, and he is asked, ¿es cierto que hubo un tiempo en que los sectores del Estado cubano trataron de restringir el nuevo arte de la juventud a principios de los 60? So course, he was a victim of that himself, and he replies, no, este intento no fue de sectores del Estado, sino de algunos funcionarios. La censura nunca ha sido política oficial de la revolución. Es más, no hay una política cultural impuesta. La actividad cultural está orientada, pero no impuesta. Jamás. So despite those absolutes of how there's no censorship, etc., in the very next column of the same article, he explains how this works. He is asked, ¿hay libertad para la creación artística en Cuba? And he responds, yo diría que hay más que en otros países que se les dan de libres. Pero naturalmente esa libertad está condicionada por la adhesión de uno a la revolución. Recuerdo aquella cita del discurso de Fidel sobre los intelectuales. Dentro de la revolución todo, fuera de la revolución nada. And then, how many artists are involved in La Nueva Trova? And then he explains that you have effectively an institution that is nationwide. So this idea, and he goes on, los profesores o profesionales son asalariados del Ministerio de Cultura. They are functionaries of the state. That means all of the folks who are the singers, compositores, cantantes, músicos, el movimiento, they call it, but effectively it's an institution. You are employed, and you have a role. Now, despite that, what I thought, and again, in my discussions and my arrival with Veronica in particular, I tried to convey what I've already explained to you, which is that this pedagogy of love seems to have filtered into every aspect of young people's lives. And I said, I wondered if it's true of music as well. And Veronica, at the time, is she here? Yeah. So at the time, she wondered what I really meant about that. And then I had selected a tons of albums. We had started on the process of digitizing. And she comes up with this very album that effectively says everything it needs to say. It's my argument. In this album, which is by Barbara Dane, she is a very famous jazz musician. She was an activist for the civil rights movement. She was also a communist, although we didn't know that at the time in the United States. She moved to Cuba permanently in 1966, and it is her album cover that really gives the argument for what I think the effect and role of La Nueva Trova is. And that is in this paragraph. ¿Qué es lo que le da unidad a este LP? En conjunto, el disco propone una visión que enlaza los sentimientos, las aspiraciones y las duras realidades que integran nuestra vida cotidiana con una dimensión histórica más amplia. Y ahora échate esto. Es decir, todas estas canciones son canciones de amor. No del estrecho amor de la pareja que todos necesitamos sentir, sino de un amor que abraza a todo un mundo en lucha. No son canciones para sentarse a dejar pasar el tiempo, sino cantos para seguir hacia adelante con nuestros compañeros por el camino largo y difícil que lleva a un mundo mejor. So there you see, these are love songs. They are ballads of love. And so it is affect, it is emotion that anchors a new consciousness of the revolution in the person through music. So one of the great examples to start us off with, and I've got about another 15 minutes, right? Is Si el Poeta Eres Tú. So this song was written by Miguel Barnet, the lyrics, and the music was Pablo Milanés. I don't know if I need to turn this off. I'm going to hit the audio, so hopefully we won't get this really squeaky sound. Let me play it.
Si el poeta eres tú, como dijo el poeta, y el que ha tumbado estrellas en 1000 noches de lluvias coloridas eres tú, que tengo yo que hablarte, comandante. Si el que asomó al futuro
which Fidel is the poet. And what does he have to say to Fidel? Nothing. Nothing. Because Fidel is the poet. And yet it is a spectacularly beautiful song. And the beauty of the music is itself a vehicle for the incorporation and the internalization of these ideas. You are part of the state. And in fact, this notion too, the idea that Fidel is a sort of surrogate for the people really plays itself out when you have a personal relationship with Fidel that you can hear and you can be part of simply by listening to this song and knowing the words. So when I came to the Estallada, I knew one song. I had written about one song, which is Acto de Fe. And I had presented about 2 years ago at the University of Florida at a conference in which there were 26 people from the island. All of them were members of the Communist Party. I did not invite them. I invited one guy who was the director of the National Library. But I was really blown away because I did this whole presentation on the pedagogy. And most of them were laughing their way through the talk. I mean, they thought this, what you guys thought was boring, they thought was hilarious. And because they were living it, they were remembering all this stuff. And then when I got to this song, I described it as a song that effectively, it deceives the listener because you think it's a love song about a woman until you get to the very end of the song, and then you suddenly go, oh my God, And when I read the lyrics, because I didn't have a copy of the song yet, I read the lyrics. The entire audience started singing the song. They knew it, even though they hadn't heard it for decades, and they were mostly people my age or in their 50s. So here we go. So let's hear part of this song. Acto de Fe.
Creo en ti, como creo cuando crece, cuando se siente y padece, al mirar alrededor. Creo en ti y me alegro que el mañana, a través de mi ventana,
I'm going to speed up a little bit.
porque dándome gustoso, viéndome mucho, siempre vuelvo a ti. Creo en ti, lleno de contradicciones, prestas soluciones, siempre creo en ti. Nada hay más humano que prenderse de tu mano y caminar creyendo en ti.
Y esto va a
Creo en ti, como creo en Dios, que no es tú, que soy yo. Como creo en Dios, que eres tú, que soy yo, en ti, revolución.
And there you have it. Creo en ti, como creo en Dios que eres tú, que soy yo, en ti, revolución. So, this song, está de madre. And Madre, which I won't play for you, but Madre by Silvio Rodriguez, also, it's a song he did two different songs titled this same way. He produced them both at the same time in 1973. This one is part of an album that commemorates the Congress of the Federation of Cuban Women. And in it, again, you think it's about a woman, you think it's about the mother, a mother, on her day. And instead, when you get to the end of the song, you realize who is your real mother. Your mother is la madre patria y la madre revolución. Madre, en tu día tus muchachos barren minas de Haipo. So it's a reference to Vietnam. But this idea that your real mother is not your mother, your real mother is the state, your real mother is the revolution, your real lover is not your lover, it's the revolution. This is not hard to find. In fact, you can find songs like this in a huge cancionario of Silvio Rodriguez. I've never heard this song recorded, we didn't find it, but this is called, literally, como si tú fueras el comunismo. And it's a ballad of love, I mean, you are so great, you're almost as great as communism. Como si tú fueras. I mean, esto está demasiado bueno. I don't know how you guys see it, but I find this extraordinary. So, explaining the paradox of living amidst the hope of dying that I referred to earlier is something easily found in the lyrics as well as the kind of march-type music that often accompanies these lyrics. But I point out what we have here. Morir es vivir. This is part of a series of songs that are called Canciones del Pueblo. This one's called Canción del Pueblo. And at the beginning of the recording, which I won't play for you because I think we're getting short on time, Silvio explains what he's doing to the audience with this song. And he says that it's supposed to be a history of Cuba, the song. And so he takes us through apparently the 19th century or something. And then we get to these parts. Morir es vivir, el 20 de mayo, el machete entre el cuero de una tradición, se llama así Martí. Morir es vivir, y con una medalla dar gracias canalla, un aplauso y adiós. Morir es vivir, y hacerse extranjero en el patio en que abuelo sembrara un alón. Vivir fue morir. En el 30 se ata, well, we could go on. But then you have this other whole set of estrofas. Vivir es morir, matar poco a poco. El ademán de loco que quiere salir. Vivir es morir, seguir otras huellas, ver nuevas estrellas, saber dónde ir. Vivir es morir. So, vivir es morir, now we're in the revolution. We're looking for other stars to guide us, not the stars of the past, not the Republic stars, but the ones that are before us in this moment. So music begins to create one common identity through collective shared consciousness of sacrifice over the course of La Nueva Trova's development. I'm going to play for you a little bit of this song because it is by a woman. It's sung by a woman. It's interpreted by Sara Gonzalez as well as Miriam Ramos. And it's a song that I think, because of the soaring quality of her voice, speaks to how, well, it speaks to this, that how do you create, how do you become part of a collective consciousness of sacrifice, where you want to honor the martyrs in your daily life, in your own mind. This starts out soft and then it gets loud, so let's see.
La muerte, con su impecable función de artesana del sol, que hace héroes, que hace historias, y no sé de un lugar para morir en esta tierra por el futuro. Se ha convertido en puñal.
So I see in that song, sorry, I switched it up. I see in this song precisely this notion that one is supposed to live one's life with possibility of death. And the great irony that neither of those things were really probably going to happen in the 1970s, because it's a period of détente. It's a period, in fact, of peace. It's a period in which Cuba is not at war. And yet, so the function of the music becomes the creation of that culture of siege and the regenerating of that idea of patriots and traitors and the need to take a side. The music, the pedagogy, and one's daily life. So to end the lecture, I also found a number of themes that tell you how to be a hero. And one is simply by staying in Cuba. You know, this song is called Yo Me Quedo, right? And it's important because these singers became internationally renowned. They actually spent most of their time outside of Cuba and playing in Europe, playing in Puerto Rico, less commonly playing in Argentina as of the openings that were created after 1983 to follow the dictatorship there. But they spent a lot of time creating music for foreign audiences. And so this became an issue, in fact, among young people's remembrances. And there's sort of, you know, the hypocrisy, right, of living outside of Cuba is almost much easier to be a revolutionary in Paris. And so that then, I think, explains why you have a number of songs written by the top artists that talk about how living in Cuba is an act of heroism. And that when one is abroad, you know, no sé quedarme. You don't stay, right? So just to be in Cuba, to live in Cuba, is an act of heroism. By the late 70s and the early 1980s, and this song is by Vicente Feliu, and then there's a kind of a, I'll point it out because it's up there, there's a whole kind of explanation of how, in fact, this person, Aurora, apparently his wife, is thrilled that he's given this album that title because she knows he will never stay, and that he is incapable of staying. And that means staying abroad and not coming home. So by the late 70s and early 80s, La Nueva Trova expanded its reach from redeeming the soul to redeeming the body for the revolutionary state. And I found a series of albums whose contents were utterly unexpected to me. And they speak to the fact that the Cuban state in the 70s was experiencing rates of growth thanks to the Soviet, the integration of to the Soviet bloc and the Soviet planning and Soviet subsidies, about 4 billion a year. It was growing at a rate of 14%. And so, in fact, there was an anti-obesity campaign in Cuba, and who knew that I would find a song about the anti-obesity campaign? And there's also a song, Cuba came late to launching an anti-smoking campaign by the state, but this album also has a song called Fumarse la Salud, which was literally a slogan of the Ministry of Public Health that says, that taught people if you're smoking your health, right? So, you know, I thought we could end on this note because it's a quite different kind of a song. Here you have very typical news reports. This is from Lexi Baldesi, who's a student of mine and who's written about the anti-obesity campaign. And so you have the song. So it's called Sedentarismo para qué? Because sedentarismo is the sitting, you know, the sittingness, right? Sitting makes you fat, you have to run, you have to do all this stuff. So here we go. I mean, I never expected that I would learn so much in so in so few days. And really, again, I'm astounded at how much there is yet to learn and to discover about Cuba's history. The personal consciousness of Cuban youth, I think, is you know, what I'm trying to understand and to come to. And to see how music would play a role in the development of consciousness and the development of self and identity, you know, it's extraordinary. And it's not just a privilege, but I clearly feel that, you know, I've been given much more than I ever expected thanks to FIU and thanks to the Ayala collection. and I hope to honor the material by doing the best job I can and writing about it. Thank you very much for your attention.